I'm Rob Barton. I'm the IAS's co-director for the Faculty of Social Sciences and Health. And it's my honour and privilege to introduce the seminar speaker today, Sowon Park, who has a lot of interests. We don't do long or formal introductions for the seminars, but I just mention amongst her many interests are the intersection between literary theory and cognitive neuroscience, which I think is going to be fairly central to today's talk on unconscious memory. And just to mention that someone started a network which has a fabulous website. I'm going to put the link in the chat now. Don't go and look at it now, because then you won't be concentrating on what someone has to say. A fabulous website about unconscious memory, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about this subject. Sowon hails from University of California at Santa Barbara at the moment, but has been all over the place: Oxford, Cambridge, Seoul, and various places. So she's well travelled and has, as I say, very diverse interests. And I'm really looking forward to hearing more about unconscious memory. Sowon.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen now. Here we go. And start. So thank you everybody for coming. I'll be speaking on the topic of unconscious memory, which may not be obvious, the meaning of which may not be immediately obvious to some of you. And this is the website that Rob was talking about. So this is a interdisciplinary research project that I have here, that I collaborate with colleagues in cognitive neuroscience, but also in computer science, and we have 5 fellows, graduate students, are working on the topic. I would like to thank Torch at Oxford for helping me set up this group, and also Crossroads at UCSB and my Little Mind fellows. So I'm going to start off by talking about the unconscious and how I, as a literary scholar, came into the topic. And this is 1905, a letter that Woolf wrote to her friend and mentor Violet Dickinson. Woolf is 23. She hasn't written anything at this point, and she says she asks Violet, "Do you think I shall ever write a really good book?" With this kind of very touching vulnerability. And it would be 10 years before she publishes her first novel, The Voyage Out, in 1915, another 10 years before she publishes her breakthrough masterpiece, Mrs. Dalloway, in 1925. So she hasn't really written anything at this stage, but already fully formed in her mind is the conviction that the literary conventions that she has inherited are quite ill-fitting, that she was not going to write a really good book with these conventions. And as she noted, quote, "The form of fiction most in vogue more often misses than secures the thing that we seek." So what is this thing that she sought, and what really makes for a really good book, according to Virginia Woolf? If we look to another letter that she wrote to her lover, Vita Sackville West, this is 1928, just before the publication of Orlando, which was a 6th novel. She says this to Vita: "The main thing in beginning a novel is to feel not that you can write it, but that it exists on the far side of a gulf which words can't cross, that it's to be pulled through only in breathless anguish. Now, when I sit down to write an article, I have a net of words which will come down on the idea, certainly in an hour or so. But a novel, to be good, should seem, before one writes it, something unwritable, only visible, so that for 9 months one lives in despair, and only when one has forgotten what one has meant does the book seem tolerable." So this idea that, this idea that journalism is written with the conscious, rational minds from which a pre-existing net of words can be drawn, while the writing of a novel involves the crossing of an abyss of the unknown, this distinction between ordinary communication and literary communication was something that Woolf drew all her life. So the defining art of fiction was for Woolf to capture in language what the mind senses but cannot quite conceptualize. Or to use a metaphor, it was to cross the narrow bridge of art over experiences below the level of conscious thought and to bring to awareness the deep symbolic structures that shape our consciousness. And this was a view of art and literature which was shared widely in literary Britain between 1880 and 1920s among symbolists, imagists, and aestheticists. It is, for example, also elaborated in the cryptic poetics of T.S. Eliot, who held the extreme view that the essence of poetry is to be communicated only subliminally and elusively, not directly. Again, making the distinction between propositional communication and poetic communication. In this context, he later proclaimed in The Music of Poetry that it's not necessary in order to enjoy the poem to know what the poem means. This conviction, Eliot's conviction, provided the foundation to pieces such as The Wasteland, where he offers us glimpses of narrative in a heap of broken images, but the sense of what's happening in the poem no sooner flickers than it fades. Thus, the reading of The Wasteland leaves us with an experience that vanishes under the scrutiny of our conscious mind. Yet also it leaves us with a lingering sense that the poet's mythological structure somehow marshals the heap of ruins into a vast web of unconscious connections. Eliot was in the habit of saying that the meaning of poetry is just the piece of meat that the burglar throws the guard dog in order to proceed with his stealthy business of charting the frontiers of consciousness. As he declared somewhat mystifyingly, the bad poet is usually unconscious where he ought to be conscious, and conscious where he ought to be unconscious. So this charting of the frontiers of consciousness found a new and central place in modernist aesthetics. We see it reflected in Eliot's concept of the idea of the objective correlative, or Woolf's idea of moments of being, Clive Bell's idea of significant form, Joyce's epiphany. These all, they're not identical, but they are all proposals about art and literature that revolves around the belief that consciousness can be shown but not said through propositional speech. Therefore, the aim of the artist, the aim of the modern artist, is to find symbolic equivalence of consciousness and try to scoop up that experience, not through conscious rational representational speech, but to express forgotten memories, barely registered sensations, and what they call hybrid emotions. Now, of course, they weren't unique in assigning the unconscious as a valuable component of art, but their aim differed from other writers in the sense that the unconscious was thought to be not just important, but the very means by which humankind could discover and explore its true identity. In the glory days of British high modernism, the unconscious was endowed with centrality so monumental that in many instances it was seen as key not only to literary value, but to truths about life itself. Now, so that was kind of the role of the unconscious in British modernism. But if we take a step back and see the wider view, we can also see that this was part of a much longer and deeper movement in cultural history, or just in history. Unconscious processes of the mind were also one of the most significant areas of developments in science between 1870 and 1930s, or what we might call the first age of modern research into the unconscious. There was a proliferation of models of the unconscious in Germany and in France in particular. So we see elaborations of what was called the subconscious mind in the ideas of Franz Mesmer, who developed the idea of animal magnetism or mesmerism, which is all channeled through the energy of the subconscious. We also see that it animated the automatic writing thesis of Piaget, who later became a galvanizing source of surrealist inspiration and later W.B. Yeats's A Vision. If we take a longer view, we can trace back the ideas of the unconscious with reference to Kant and Goethe and Schopenhauer, but all these models tend to culminate in the psychoanalytical models of Freud. So as we know, Freud had a topographical model of the mind. So you had the conscious mind and the unconscious mind, and that was separated by a barrier, a repression barrier. So he uses the hydraulic model of repression, and it's divided, and kind of the egg model of the mind is Freud's own drawing, that it had a dynamic of hydraulics, but mostly the unconscious mind could not be accessed by the conscious mind. He did make some allowances for the occasional breakthrough through symbols in dreams and verbal slips and art, but normally it was divided. And then later in Lacanian psychoanalysis, this is even more overdetermined. Lacan posits that the conscious mind and the unconscious mind are completely and eternally split. So to sum up this model of mind, Meltzer writes in critical terms on the chapter on the unconscious, which is very good. The unconscious is by definition unseeable. Its existence is inferred rather than empirically demonstrated by occurrences in life which are not consciously motivated. So this is kind of I think a broadly true definition of the understanding of the unconscious in this first period, that the mind is divided and the unconscious cannot be known. You can only be inferred. So I've just sketched the history of the unconscious in this particular period, and now I'm going to bring memory into the discussion. And one might wonder, what does memory have to do with any of this? Because memory is something that we normally like to think about as being conscious. So this is a definition in the Dictionary of Psychology. Conscious memory, memory for material that one is aware of. Explicit memory for previously presented material is tapped by tasks like recall and recognition, where the individual is consciously aware of the knowledge held and can recall it or recognize it among several alternatives. So when people use the term memory, they tend to use it in this sense, that it's conscious memory. However, in the 1990s, slightly before that, but actually properly in the 1990s, research in cognitive psychology, neuropsychology, and neuroscience converged on the idea that the human memory system is comprised of two separate systems. One is the conscious memory system, the other is the unconscious memory system, or in the language of neuroscience, you have declarative memory, memory that declares itself, and non-declarative memory, i.e., memory that does not declare itself to the conscious mind. And it's the non-declarative memory that I would like to focus on. So what exactly is non-declarative memory or unconscious memory? What does it mean to remember without actually knowing that you remember? And how do we know that we remember if we can't know that we remember? So a classic example in neuroscience is something like this. A 2-year-old boy is knocked down by a large dog. As a grown man, he won't have a conscious memory of this incident, but he may have a phobia or fear of dogs, which he will understand that it's just part of his personality, not as a memory. This is the kind of non-conscious memory or unconscious memory that I would like to focus on. So beginning in the 1980s, neuroscientists like Eric Kandel, Brenda Milner, Sue Corkin, Larry Squire, and many others established that the human memory system is comprised of numerous separate processes, that memory isn't just one thing. It's an umbrella term to refer to a lot of different systems. And so this is the earliest publication of the taxonomy of long-term memory in mammals, including humans. So I'm not talking about working memory, short-term memory, as it's often called, but long-term memory, which is divided, as you can see in the taxonomy, into declarative explicit memory and non-declarative implicit memory. And at the end, you see the structures, the neural structures that support each of these systems. And it's very complicated. I'm just going to talk very briefly about what they are and why this is relevant. So declarative explicit memory are things like facts and events, things that we know that we can remember. It's normally autobiographical. The sense of self is central to autobiographical memory because you remember things with reference to yourself normally. Facts would be something like Virginia Woolf published 9 novels. That's a fact that I remember because I acquired that memory, or I memorized it. Or it might be some events, might be something like, we had the election last week. I can remember that. I can consciously remember that. Or it might be something like remembering the taste of McConnell ice cream because McConnell ice cream is a local ice cream. When I first tasted it, it was just astounding. I can still remember that memory. Or it might be childhood memory, like lying in bed, looking at shadows. That kind of memory is all declarative explicit memory, the kind of memory that we normally think of as what memories are. However, there are all these other systems which are not normally regarded as memory, which is crucial to the kind of charting of the frontiers of consciousness that Woolf and Eliot and all these modern writers were so fascinated by. So what are these? So it'd be something like skills and habits. A lot of it is what we normally call muscle memory. So swimming, cycling, skiing, these are things that you acquire and you never really forget. You don't know how you remember, but it's kind of muscle memory. It might also be like, the perfect tennis stroke or an effortless pirouette, all these things that we acquire. These are not obviously not muscles remembering, but the non-declarative memory, which is striatum related, which has to do with habit. We don't know how we remember, but it's a very, very powerful form of memory that endures even long after the declarative memory system is broken down. So with Alzheimer's patients, I'm sure you've read a lot of reports how they can, a lot of patients can still play the piano, which is another form of non-declarative memory, after the autobiographical self is completely disintegrated. Another thing that's relevant is reading and writing. Once you acquire literacy, you can't unlearn it because it's a very, very robust form of non-declarative memory. So if you read various writing systems, once you learn how to read that writing system, you cannot see them as shapes anymore. That you will always automatically and non-declaratively get the meaning of the shapes without making any effort. It's automatic. So all forms of recognition, including rhythm, the ability to recognize a rhythm, repetition, getting a sense of flow, these are all supported very, very strongly by the non-declarative memory system. Writers have always known this. Poets, they set up a pattern which they deviate from, and in literary criticism this is called entrainment, that you would build lots of parallelism in order to deviate from it, in order to create the sense of surprise or shock, i.e. that all writers have already known how to make the most of the skills and habits that come naturally to us, i.e. the non-declarative memory system. On a different level, the non-declarative memory system is not just about skills and habits that involves a muscle or a skill, but well, I'll just read this quote because I think it's so relevant. So this is T.S. Eliot, Music of Poetry, says, "I have never been able to retain the names of," I'm just going to make this small, feet and meters, or to pay the proper respect to the accepted rules of scansion. The only way to learn to manipulate any kind of English verse seem to be by assimilation and imitation, by becoming so engrossed in the work of a particular poet that one could produce a recognizable derivative." And again, he here is utilizing the non-declarative memory system. So I'm just going to, there we go. There we are. But it's also cognitive and emotional habits that we might apply this memory system to. It might be habits of loving, patterns of loving, inclination, preferences are supported very, very strongly by non-declarative memory system. Or habits of hating, aversion and craving are supported by remembering that these are the things that made you feel good and these are things that made you feel bad. It's hugely associative. Addiction is fueled by memory, non-declarative memory often, but also many, many emotions around anticipation, such as surprise, pleasure, longing, are greatly supported by and influenced by unconscious memory. So unconscious memory shapes and enables perception, volition, inclination, understanding, all of these things which we normally think of as being part of who we are. And it's all of these things are hugely dependent on the memory that we have acquired unconsciously. I'm not going to go into the how this really relates to the objective correlative or significant form. There are wonderful podcasts on the website. Other people have presented on this topic. But so what I'm interested in doing is understanding a lot of the literary theories informed by this development. So this is again Virginia Woolf on style, which I hope makes the point that I would like to put to you. And she says this, sorry, go back. Style is a very simple matter. It's all rhythm. Once you get that, you can't use the wrong words. This is very profound what rhythm is and goes far deeper than words. A sight, an emotion creates this wave in the mind long before it makes words to fit it. And in writing, one has to recapture this and set this working, which has nothing apparently to do with words. And then as it breaks and tumbles in the mind, it makes the words to fit in. Just go back to, so once we recast what we normally used to think of as the unconscious as forms of non-declarative memory, and we take another look at the topographical model provided by Freud, which has been so influential, Freud thought memories had a small role in what he called the preconscious. But actually, if you think about all the other aspects of the personality that he charted, we can now understand that memories, including unconscious memories, actually informs most of the unconscious as well as most of the conscious. So to return to literature and try to conclude, there we are. This is a quote from Squire and Candell, Memory from Mind to Molecule. These various forms of non-declarative memory are ancient in evolutionary terms. They are reliable and consistent, and they provide for myriad unconscious ways of responding to the world, in no small part by virtue of the unconscious status of these forms of memory. They create much of the mystery of the human experience. Here arise the dispositions, habits, and preferences that are inaccessible to conscious recollection, but nevertheless are shaped by past events, influence our behavior and mental life, and are an important part of who we are. So people don't generally remember consciously the circumstances in which they acquired the principles and the passions that govern their lives, because our principles or value systems or even morals are acquired gradually and almost unconsciously through the non-declarative memory system. And this is something that the modernists, the British modernists, were hugely interested in, and actually did record in in minute detail how this works. So if we look at the case of Virginia Woolf, this is her declarative memory trying to recapture why she became the person that she became. And this is from her memoir, Sketch of the Past. And she says this: if life has a base that it stands upon, if it's a bowl that one fills and fills and fills, then my bowl, without a doubt, stands upon this memory. So she's talking about conscious memory. It's of lying half asleep, half awake, in bed, in the nursery at St. Ives. It's of hearing the waves breaking 1, 2, 1, 2, and sending a splash of water on the beach, and then breaking 1, 2, 1, 2 behind the yellow blind. It is of hearing the blind draw its little acorn across the floor as the wind blew the blind out. It is of lying and hearing the splash and seeing this light and feeling it is almost impossible that I could be here, of feeling the purest ecstasy that I can conceive. Now, this is Woolf's conscious recollection of her earliest memory. But she had so many comments and observations about how she works to a rhythm, that all her writing is writing to a rhythm, and the structuring of her masterpiece, The Waves, where she's recreating that rhythm, that she feels this is natural and inevitable. I think one could risk a theory that the base of the bowl of Woolf's literary life, that filled and filled and filled, was, it may be partly the conscious memory, but the conscious memory is really fueled by the surrendering of our conscious mind to the unconscious accumulative rhythm that she acquired as a child. So this is just a speculation. So I'm just going to end by trying to point to how she wrote, and why bringing of literature is relevant to theories of the mind. I'll try to do this in this section. So this is from Mrs. Dalloway, and I'm just going to brief, because not everybody will have read Mrs. Dalloway, so I'm just going to explain it very, very briefly in order to get to the point of what she created, what she wanted to create, what she thought was a really great novel, and what she achieved in writing Mrs. Dalloway. So Mrs. Dalloway is a story of Clarissa, one day in the life of Clarissa, and Peter Walsh. This section is about about a friend, Peter Walsh, who has come back from India. They were going to get married at some point when they were both very, very, very young. Clarissa rejected him. Peter went to India. After 20 years, he's come back. They have not met in the meanwhile, and he visits her out of the blue on the morning of Clarissa's party. And they've had the encounter, and this is Peter as he steps outside of Clarissa's door, and what goes in his mind like 5 minutes after he departs from Clarissa's house. And this is how Woolf tries to capture the frontiers of consciousness of the character Peter Walsh. So it says, remember my party, said Peter Walsh, as he stepped down the street, speaking to himself rhythmically in time with the flow of the sound, the direct downright sound of Big Ben striking the half hour, the leaden circles dissolved in the air. So far, it's quite standard. Remember my party is what Clarissa said to Peter as he was leaving, and he's remembering Clarissa's voice, and the omniscient narrator is telling us, said Peter Walsh, as he stepped down the street, speaking to himself rhythmically. So we have an external narrator observing a character remembering what somebody said. And then in brackets, you've got the sound of Big Ben, which is not really thought by Peter Walsh, but we can infer that Peter Walsh has heard the sound of the Big Ben, but it's in brackets. So, oh, these parties, he thought, Clarissa's parties, still quite straightforward. Like he's having this thought, oh, these parties, you know, oh, Clarissa's parties. Why does she give these parties? He thought. Not that he blamed her or this effigy of a man in a tailcoat with a carnation in his buttonhole coming towards him. Now, something very strange happens here. As he's listening to the rhythmic sound of Big Ben, and he's barely aware of hearing it, suddenly, almost as a reflex, we can see him look at the man who's coming towards him, and that triggers an automatic and unconscious comparison. This effigy of a man, like this down and out man in a tailcoat with a carnation in his buttonhole coming towards him, which triggers the next thought: only one person in the world could be as he was, in love, because he's come to England to get married. He's walked out. He's hearing Big Ben. He's remembering Clarissa's invitation. He's thinking, oh, Clarissa is kind of dismissing her. He sees a man coming towards him. The sight triggers a comparison, and it kind of shores him up. And it's a reminder that he, Peter, is a man in love. He's kind of bigged up by this. And there he was, this fortunate man himself, reflected in the plate glass window of a motor car manufacturer in Victoria Street. So now we know that he's walking down Victoria Street. He's seen the car shop. In the window, he sees himself, this fortunate man. Again, we can infer that he's automatically compared himself with this man in a tailcoat that he's just seen. And then suddenly his thought is, all India lay behind him, plains, mountains, epidemics of cholera, a district twice as big as Ireland, decisions he had come to alone. He, Peter Walsh, was now really, for the first time in his life, in love. So in a nanosecond, he sees the man, he sees himself, and he thinks all of India lay behind him. And then because he's so bigged up, now he can afford to be a little bit judgmental about Clarissa. Clarissa had grown hard, he thought, a trifle sentimental into the bargain, he suspected, looking at the great motor cars, capable of doing how many miles on how many gallons? So he's having two thoughts, like, you know, feeling sorry for Clarissa, feeling superior to Clarissa, and he's looking at the cars. And then that triggers another self-perception. For he had a turn for mechanics, had invented a plough in his district, had ordered wheelbarrows from England, but the coolies wouldn't use them, all of which Clarissa knew nothing whatever about. So these are thoughts, like when he's having conscious thoughts, the narrator says he thought this and he said that, but these are all half-formulated frontiers of consciousness, as it were. The way she said, here is my Elizabeth, that annoyed him. Why not here's Elizabeth simply? It was insincere, and Elizabeth didn't like it either. Brackets, still the last tremors of the great booming voice shook the air around him. The half hour, still early, only 11:30 still. So again, we are being situated into the time and space that Peter is in, and so we are sharing this time and space with them, as it were. And then this is Peter back in his mind again, for he understood young people, he liked them. There was always something cold in Clarissa, he thought. She had always, even as a girl, sort of timidity, which in middle age becomes conventionality, and then it's all up, he thought, looking rather drearily into the glassy depths and wondering whether by calling at that hour he had annoyed her, overcome with shame suddenly at having been a fool, wept, been emotional, told her everything, as usual, as usual. As a cloud crosses the sun, silence falls on London and falls on the mind. Effort ceases. Time flaps on the mast. There we stop. There we stand, rigid. The skeleton of habit alone upholds the human frame. Where there is nothing, Peter Walsh said to himself, feeling hollowed out, utterly empty within. Clarissa refused me, he thought. He stood there thinking, Clarissa refused me. So we see he was flushed with pride, and then he sees himself and he's kind of feeling superior to Clarissa, but all of a sudden the kind of memories that he repressed erupts, and the abject sense of despair that he experienced 20 years ago when he was refused by Clarissa resurfaces. And suddenly, in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a thought, he's bereft of all confidence and vanity, and he has to finally admit that his core emotion is one of rejection. So in 3 paragraphs, Woolf renders Peter's mind as this continual integration of incoming visual and auditory signals with a range of factual, emotional, unconscious memories associated with all of them, finally producing what she wanted to achieve, which was an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. That was her aim, to record atoms as they fall upon the mind in the order in which they fall. And so why compare this with neuroscience? That's the big question. And I'll just end with a quote, which is that this is from E.O. Wilson, the biologist. He says this: if literary productions can be solidly connected to biological roots, it will be one of the greatest events of intellectual history. Science and humanities reunited or united. And I will end the talk here. My talk was a little bit gappy, I realized, but hopefully you will challenge me with questions and I'll have the opportunity to fill some of the gaps in. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sowon. I really loved that, really enjoyed that. And I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. Could I ask people, we'll try this out. If you've got a question, just type Q into the chat and then I'll keep track of who's got a question and what order they're in. So, okay, Charles has got right in there. Can you unmute yourself and ask a question?
Yeah, thanks, Rob, and thank you, Sowon. That was really fascinating. Woolf's, you talked about Woolf in a very interesting way. I think her theory of consciousness changes over her life. I think it's complex and it's paradoxical. And I'd like to know what you think about sort of 3 ways in which you can trace her account. So she talks about the much of life being lived non-consciously. She talks about the cotton wool of existence, moments where we're not actually even conscious, where much of our life is taken up with sort of day-to-day stuff that doesn't really amount to much. Then there's the famous quote from modern fiction, "Let us record the atoms," which are also sort of ordinary everyday moments, but which are presumably conscious because they don't make much sense in terms of recording them in a literary form. They are not, however, moments of being. Moments of being are the 3rd category, if you like, and these are the moments of deep significance, similar to Joycean epiphanies, as you said, but they're nevertheless still conscious, aren't they? They're not, I mean, they're connected to the unconscious. Of course, all literature, I think, probably accesses memory, accesses what is not immediately present. But moments of being, however, the various ways in which she defines them, they are conscious. So I wonder, I've puzzled myself over how this sort of theory develops over her life. She's writing about moments of being in 1939, just before her death. And I wonder if you can trace a path through it, whether you see the same sorts of paradoxes, and also can comment on why she didn't start reading Freud until 1939.
On the Freud question, I've often thought myself, and I have not found a satisfactory answer. So that's what I say. But about the her theories of consciousness, I'm not sure whether I see it as quite as paradoxical as you do. So this is how I see it in you know, the cotton wool, moments of non-being as opposed to moments of being, and the atoms. I do see them as being very closely integrated, and the atoms as they fall upon the mind, moments of being. I think that what she's talking about is connected to what she wrote to Vita Sackville-West, that when you really try to create moments of being, or life, as she called it, what you're trying to do is to be able to, what you know, as you tried to do with the creation of Peter Walsh, create all the aspects of experience that you cannot consciously see at the same time. I said that very badly. I'll have another go. So to create a full life, to recreate the experience of life, you cannot just say, you know, Peter Walsh is walking down Victoria Street. You've got to recreate the forgotten memories and the hybrid emotions, things that he's barely aware of, into the mix, because that's what life is. We are not aware of the atoms falling upon the mind in the order in which they fall. That's the job of the novelist, to recreate that and try to do that as best as one can, i.e. try to recreate not just perceptions, but unconscious perceptions, not just memories that we can consciously recall, but unconscious memories. And of course, this is an impossible task, but once you layer life with the visible things as well as the invisible things that we sense all the time without knowing that we sense them, then you can make the frog leap, as she writes, you know, that section when she's talking about scientists dissecting, but you can't create life. That's how you create something that we call life. So that would be my answer. You probably don't agree, but that's my reading.
Thank you. And then just a very quick comment to follow up. There's another sense in which she talks about consciousness, the idea of there being a consciousness beyond us, whose role the artist's role to access that consciousness. And we're all kind of part of a great big work of art as in our lives. And it's the novelist who can access that.
Yes. And of course, she felt every single time that she had failed. Like all her life, she thought that she failed at everything. So it's not as if she thought that she had crossed that abyss, you know, the far side. She just wanted to get there because that was her aim. But none of these people ever thought that they reached what they wanted, that they created life. But I think we can see their effort, and they're empiricists. I mean, they're such close observers of the senses. This is why I think it's so valuable in many ways. Thank you, Charles.
Okay, so yeah, just to remind you, type a Q in the chat if you have a question. While we're waiting, I'll ask one, I think. So I guess there are two ideas about memory in general. One is that they're passively created, that environments impress themselves on our minds, and events impress themselves on our minds, and that's how memories are formed. And another is that we actively construct them, and in doing so create a narrative about ourselves and the world. And I was just wondering whether that distinction is, do you find that useful? Do you veer towards, you know, one kind of approach in your argument? And what implications would, like an active construction, for example, that sort of account have for the things that you're saying?
Thank you, Rob. That's brilliant, because conscious memory goes through a continual process of reconsolidation, and it's narrativized into something that may or may not be true. Just because you remember it doesn't necessarily make that memory true. It's just been heavily consolidated. So the unreliability of the conscious memory system, there's absolutely lots and lots of fascinating work on the unreliability of eyewitness testimonies. there's a saying that, oh, he was lying like a eyewitness, reconstructivist, because what you remember seeing is completely unreliable most of the time. And also memory is constructed and consolidated with reference to yourself. So it's already extremely biased, as we know from films like Rashomon. You remember the event as it relates to yourself, which is not all of the picture, because it's a perspectivized picture. But I think with non-declarative memory, it's more robust, and it's not so prone to reconsolidating with this agenda of shoring yourself up. So I think that question depends on whether you're talking about the declarative memory system or the non-declarative memory system.
Thank you. We got a question from Aidan Horner.
Hello. Thanks for a really interesting talk. So I wanted to ask you a bit more about the manner in which you define the difference between declarative and non-declarative memory. So you had an interesting interpretation, which is that your description was that the unconscious was declaring itself to the conscious, and that was an interesting interpretation, because I've always interpreted declarative to mean I can declare it to someone else, as opposed to my unconscious declaring it to me, as it were. And if you take my interpretation, then there are clearly situations where the memory itself isn't unconscious, but it is non-declarative, in the sense that we essentially lack the linguistic ability to declare it to another person. So riding a bike is, I think, a good example of this. I know that I have the knowledge to ride a bike. I feel that I can understand that knowledge when I'm cycling, but I can't really explain that to someone else. And that's why it's a non-declarative memory. So I guess my question after that long rambling interlude is to what extent do you think there is this sort of true unconscious set of experiences relative to just a lot of abilities, habits, etc., that we simply aren't able to really articulate in a meaningful way?
Thank you, Aidan. The idea that memory isn't one thing has a very long history. It didn't begin in the 1990s or 1980s. I mean, you can go back to William James, where he distinguishes between memory and habit. Bergson thought that habit is a memory that's profoundly different. So he already kind of knew it was a kind of a memory. In psychology, the terms have been explicit memory and implicit memory. Declarative memory and non-declarative memory is a neuroscientific term that comes from Larry Squire, and that's how he uses the term. It's not the distinction that I make. Non-declarative memory is memory that does not declare itself to the conscious mind, is a definition that he provides in the 1996 paper. But also we have interesting parallels in AI. So you remember Winograd made the distinction between procedural memory and declarative memory, and all of these things overlap to a large point. What's significant about that chart is that we now have insight into the neural structures that support these different types of memory, and that they work in parallel and in combination, and sometimes one overrides the other. So when you remember something, it might be declarative memory working in association with non-declarative memory. So you have a sense that this is familiar, but you can't, and so they're working continually together and sometimes overriding the other. And so the categories have become a lot more precise than before. And I think that is a huge step forward. Does that answer the question?
In some aspects, yes. Yeah. I mean, it's a very tricky issue. I mean, there's lots of ways when we create these binary dissociations. We tend to say, okay, well, one's unconscious and one's conscious. One's supported by one brain structure and one's supported by another brain structure. And I guess I worry sometimes that we're looking so much for these dichotomies that we lose sight of the overlap between them in some situations. It's not to criticize that dichotomy per se, it's just to say that sometimes it isn't as clean cut as it might seem.
Can I add an interesting example to that? I absolutely agree. It's not dichotomous. It's the whole umbrella. It's a complex system of memories. It's not one thing. It's not two things. There are lots and lots of things which we now know through the example of, for example, space. I really wanted to talk about that. I didn't have time to go into it, but you know, there are things like space cells and grid cells. And John O'Keefe and the Moses, they won the Nobel Prize for this in 2014, is that remembering space is non-declarative. You have space and grid cells in the hippocampus. So, and I don't seem to have a lot of these cells because I have very little sense of space. But all mammals will unconsciously track where they are in space. And these place cells and grid cells, they remember where you are in that particular setting, so that you can find your way back home. So space and unconscious memory is not something that you would normally think about, because we make an effort to find our way home. So it's the conscious memory system working, the hippocampus, working together with the place cells and the grid cells, which is non-declarative, and it's in the same area of the brain, except that now we know that there are two neural circuits, because we see this in patients damaged with, you know, of the medial temporal lobe, like patients like EP. They can still find their way home when they can't remember a single thing about themselves. So these are the kinds of really interesting discoveries, I think, that makes us understand that there are multiple systems at work, and when one fails, another can step in. Anyway, so I think like the work on space is just absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, I think there are some big ontological questions there actually, and about our categories and how those map onto brain structures that I think that whole area is becoming really fascinating now. So for example, I saw recently a paper about social space being encoded in the hippocampus, which is a totally different kind of space, but it raises some interesting questions. Okay, so next we have Laszlo has a question.
You already noted that oftentimes we remember things that never happened. So what we remember and what is in our memory cannot be the same thing, because if it is in the memory, it should have happened. Now, if it is problematic in the case of the conscious memory, and as you argued that the unconscious is only inferred, how on earth can we infer what is in the memory? So isn't it a construct that is only used retrospectively and not predictively?
The unconscious, have I got that right?
Okay, so how can we know what is in the unconscious memory of someone? It looks to me that it's only not really substantiated hypothesis that there is a memory behind it.
Okay, well that's I didn't have time to go through the decades of empirical experiments that demonstrate the existence of non-declarative memory systems, and it began with a patient called HM, which is and Brenda Milner's fantastic work on it. So HM had complete amnesia, so he could not acquire new memories, and he had retrograde amnesia as well, because he had bisection of the medial temporal lobe, both sides. However, the empirical demonstration of non-declarative memory that Brenda Milner pioneered was through performance. So it's a very, very famous experiment of—
I know the experiment, I'm sorry, this is exactly what I'm saying, that what is observable is not the memory, but the behavior, and the memory is only a hypothesis behind it.
Why would that be? Because HM—
Because we don't observe it.
Sorry? We observe it?
we don't observe it. What we observe is the behavior. And it's a hypothesis. What we use to explain this behavior is the memory, but we don't know whether it's there or not.
We don't know whether there's a memory behind the performance.
Mm-hmm.
Is that so? What would be producing the improved speed and dexterity and ability of the subjects? I mean, how do you see that?
I mean, I'm not a psychologist, but say divine intervention. I don't care. The only point is that it's a metaphysical question whether it's there or not, and I have personally serious doubts about it.
I think you're a radical behaviorist, Laszlo.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so maybe that's another discussion. Thank you.
I stop it. Okay.
Okay, so next question is from Porter.
Thank you. Sowon, I love this, and I especially love your effort to catch the complexity of the subject, and the declarative memory and undeclared memory there is usually a binary between what's conscious and what's unconscious. That's a simple thing, but then what you're showing is the immensity of the unconscious, and it's the different kinds of wiring that come into play and out of play. But looking at Mrs. Dalloway, the novel, there is an incident that somebody else, I believe, remembers that happened to her and her youth. And that was observing her sister being crushed by a falling tree. The tree was sawn down in an irresponsible way. And it seems to me that you could make the case, I've tried to make it actually, that you could see the meandering structure of the novel, which seems almost entirely plotless, as determined by this trauma. I mean, it's extraordinary trauma when you think about it and try and reenact it in your mind. And Virginia Woolf, quite consciously, inserted that. And I think there are a couple of references to it. I think Peter does, or maybe somebody else. But depending on how vividly the reader is aware of that, you could account for her behavior, that is moving from one thought to another, and Virginia Woolf's behavior too. I mean, the images, the movements, the sounds that you hear, the thoughts that you are aware of are all in a kind of jumble. And that is one of the things that she's praised for, that she tried to capture that kind of fragmentary nature of the immediate experience. But it could be that you could organize that entire disparate seeming narrative in terms of this trauma. I mean, there are times when she thinks how dangerous the world is. She has a memory of herself. I think it's one of the vacation spots of being absolutely totally frightened, and it seems to come out of the blue. But Virginia Woolf put it into the words of another person, so it's more like a controlling memory that that controls her behavior and the structure of the novel. I don't want to go too far in this, and I had another question, but I just wanted to throw that out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Porter. I mean, the section that I read with you is probably the simplest section in all of the novel, because other sections are so layered with other people's thoughts and, you know, misconceptions and misperceptions, you know, wrong memories. It's just too complicated to talk about, because I hadn't assumed that everybody would be familiar with the novel. Peter Walsh is very straightforward because he's alone. He's also a very kind of egocentric man, and so all the thoughts tend to be a little bit simpler than Clarissa's or Septimus's. But you know, I agree with your reading, but the magic of a rich novel like Mrs. Dalloway is that the interpretation is, you know, it's almost limitless, because she's made such a web of connections, just like life. So I will just agree with you, Porter.
Well, I would agree with you. And what I'm trying to say is that there are two views you could have of the scattered nature, the very rich, wonderful scattered nature of what is happening from moment to moment in the novel.
As
yet,
nothing is ever.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing is ever one thing. You know, this is something that she used to come back to a lot, that nothing in life is ever one thing.
Okay, on that just seems like the right note to finish on. I'm really sorry for the people who still have questions. We haven't been able to get to everybody who had questions, but obviously there's been a tremendous amount of interest, and so I'd like to thank Sowon again for an absolutely fabulous talk, and yeah, thanks very much.